Hello everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Eurocontrol's Aviation Hard Talk Live. This is the series of programs where we talk about what's going on in the aviation industry, what we can do to recover from the pandemic, and how not just recover, but how do we build back better into the future. As you know, we've been running this series for 6 months and we've spoken to a number of the leaders in the aviation industry, and we're leaving till last for this year, not forever, but and Eamonn will have some very good news about that in a moment. But we're leaving until last the largest of Europe's carriers, and indeed one of the most famous of all of the characters in European aviation, Mr. Michael O'Leary. Indeed, if you saw the advertising for this, you'll know that he has been described as a legend of European aviation, a question I think we should be investigating a little further. But before we do that, as is usual, I'd like to ask the Director General of Eurocontrol, Mr. Eamonn Brennan, if he'd be so kind as to give us an update on what's going on in the market. Eamonn, thank you.
Good afternoon from Brussels, and it's good to see everybody here again at a new Aviation Hard Talk. A special welcome to our star guest, Michael O'Leary, CEO of Europe's largest airline, Ryanair, and Andrew, of course. So we'll turn to those guys in a couple of minutes, but as is traditional now, we just have a look at some of the key facts and statistics that will actually help frame the discussion for Michael and for Andrew. So first of all, we're looking at a very unique model in the low-cost segment, which is really not a new model. 2005, 13% of the market was what we now define as low cost, maybe low fares. By 2019, this was 30%. And even in the middle of the pandemic, you're looking at 25%. But let's just have a quick look. How did the low costs react to the pandemic? Have a look at this. So you can see everybody was moving up and down. It looks very like a stock exchange, a huge plunge right along the bottom, right through the summer months, and then a sharp recovery by Ryanair and Wizz, etc., and then a decline as we hit a second wave of traffic. And really, at the moment, we're down at a very difficult situation, facing into a Christmas, which is going to be tricky. One of the things I just wanted to mention to everybody is last week, ECDC and EASA issued new guidelines. And it really is important that you do everything possible to work with your governments and your administrations, because it's really clear what the guidelines say. Travellers should not be treated as high risk. They should be treated the same way as local residents. And our information is that this is not happening throughout Europe. So any help you can give on this will be really good. Let's look at the last week. Yesterday, flights were down 66% over the same day last year. You have to go back to the early 70s before you got this volume of flight, and you have to go back to the Second World War before you got a crisis that was as tricky as the COVID one. When we look also at the status of the traffic scenarios that we issued, only in the middle of September we were going along and getting the traffic really well in coordination with the airlines. But what's really significant is in the last month, the situation has significantly deteriorated. You've had quarantines, lockdowns, uncoordinated measures, and we were hoping for a recovery at Christmas, and we do expect to get more flights back into the system, but I think it's going to be pretty tricky. You're not going to get anything very strong until Q1 of next year, hopefully when we roll out a vaccine. What's interesting is your guest today, Ryanair. We're looking at the 737 MAX. They should be recertified for flights in Europe, we imagine, in January. And it's amazing, 210 73 MAXs been bought. And it'll be a good question to see how Michael responds to how does somebody buy new aircraft in the middle of a big downturn, or maybe it's the right time to buy them. For me, the vaccine process is really important. And what's happening? So for us, it's important to realise that the vaccine will actually give a little ray of light. It's going to take 15,000 flights to roll out the vaccine all over the world. But we are saying that by next summer, we should see sufficient take-up to enable a reasonably progressive recovery. Interesting, and maybe it's something you could look at, is airlines such as Qantas are saying they won't allow long-haul travel unless you've got a vaccination certificate. Now remember, in the past we had vaccination certificates for yellow fever and all of these kind of things as well. So it's not something entirely new. So just want to mention that coming up in Q1 of 2021, we have a whole new range of speakers. Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas, Ben Smith of Air France KLM, Johan Lundgren, John Holland Kay, Ed Sims, from WestJet, John Slattery, and Henrik Holloy. What's amazing about this bunch is they're all lads. And it is a bit disappointing that in 2020 that we really don't have a deep pool of female CEOs and airline CEOs as well. And this is something in Eurocontrol that we're working on to build up more involvement for females and for ladies in aviation. So I'm hopeful that in the future, when I present this vast array of celebrities to you, that we might see a big change in the gender balance. So let's see how Ryanair got on and hear the story.
So, Michael, welcome to Hard Talk. Thanks very much for joining us. The advertising that Eurocontrol put out for this ahead of the game described you as a legend of European aviation. Do you think you're a legend?
I bloody hope not. Firstly, welcome to everybody. We're speaking to you here from COVID-free Dublin, but we're taking all the usual mask precautions anyway. No, I dislike the term legend because it usually implies that you're dead. And I would rather stay very much alive, at least for the next 5 years, which I think would be a very strong post-COVID recovery.
Right. But in fact, I mean, you've run the most successful airline in Europe. You're the longest serving ongoing airline CEO in Europe. You've also got a very successful stud farm. You breed stud bulls. You don't want to follow the example of Willie Walsh and find a nice cushy job to run out the end of your time?
No, unlike Willie, I have 4 young children who are generally between the ages of about, I think, the 15 down to 10. And therefore, the more time I spend at home, the more time it makes me miss work. Willie's at a different phase in his life. His family are grown. He did a remarkable job in IAG. And, you know, I think he wants to do something different. I'm more challenged here in Ryanair. I own 4% of the company, so a lot of my personal wealth is tied up in the success of Ryanair. And I'm very committed to what I think will be a very exciting 4 or 5 year post-COVID recovery business environment here in Europe.
Right. And on that point, in fact, you're in the news for all of last week for a really quite headline-breaking purchase or confirmation of an order for a further 75 737 Maxes. You've obviously got faith in that aeroplane?
I do. I think Boeing, the new management team at Boeing, led by Dave Calhoun, they've done a remarkable job, I think, at Boeing in the last 12 months. I mean, not alone have they been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, but also the grounding of the MAX. They've done remarkable work with the FAA, with Patrick Key and EASA. The aircraft has now been certified to go back into service in North America. We expect it'll be certified to go back into service in Europe in early January. And we're very much looking forward to taking delivery of the 8200s. We expect to get 30 of them in the spring. We've already installed 3 MAX simulators. All of our pilots, all of our technical people who have gone on the simulator, flown the aircraft, they rave about the aircraft. It's a great aircraft. It's a very safe aircraft. And I'm very confident that our customers, once they start traveling on this plane in the summer 2021, will love it too.
Do you see any sort of pushback in the short term with the customers?
Not really. I mean, will there be ones or twos who want to offload? I think there will. And I think rather than make an issue out of it, we said if you want to offload off a MAX aircraft, you can offload and go on the next available flight. Because, you know, that's how strong our confidence is in the aircraft. But most people, like myself, don't know what aircraft they're flying on. As long as the interior is nice and new and roomy, and the interiors of the 8200s, the game changers, are fantastic. Long, wider legroom, much more comfy seats, the new Boeing Sky interiors. And I think it's critical that we have additional capacity coming to us. I mean, I see a strong recovery into 2021. Vaccines will roll out in the first quarter. But the challenge for us and for all our airport partners in Europe is going to be, nobody's going to want to put planes back in the sky. They're going to be slow. The legacies are going to try to get slot extensions so that they can hang on or squat on their slots and constrain growth and keep prices high. We need these new aircraft so that actually we'll be one of the few airlines capable of adding capacity and working with our airport partners across Europe to restore traffic that has been lost as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
So, in fact, there's a lot of issues to talk about there. One is, and you did it in the financial crisis of 08-09 as well. You've put on capacity just when everybody else is taking their capacity off, sort of counter-cyclically. It worked for you that time. You obviously think it's going to work this time as well?
I think it is going to work. I think it'll work better this time. I mean, I think this time there's been a big capacity shakeout in Europe. You see the demise of Thomas Cook, Flybe, German Wings. Alitalia has reduced its fleet by some 25%. So has Lufthansa. The legacy guys have taken out 10, 20% of that capacity. And I'm not sure that will ever come back. They see this as an opportunity to reset the marketplace. They've all received multi-billions of state aid. And they want to come back with less capacity and much higher prices. They want to go back to the bad old days when Europe was all run by bilateral flag carriers. Unless you have additional capacity, which is why I think Ryanair's Boeing MAX order is so critical, unless we can add additional capacity into that marketplace to take up the slack that will have been left by Norwegian, EasyJet's cutbacks, then fares will rise. So I think it's absolutely imperative that we buy new aircraft from Boeing. We've repriced the aircraft so they'll be a little bit more cheaper than we had originally negotiated. But they're still going to be a great aircraft. And here's an aircraft that allows us to fly 4% more passengers on every flight, but burns 16% less fuel. So not alone is it cheaper, phenomenally more operationally efficient, but it's greener and cleaner as well. It's the game changer.
Okay, the number of interesting points there. The large legacy carriers have got rid of their large aircraft, leaving them with a lot more smaller or proportionally more small aircraft, which doesn't that put them into the same market as you?
No, I mean, they've got rid of a lot of them. A lot of the legacy carriers are still hanging on to the long-haul fleets. Alitalia has reduced its short-haul fleet by some 25%. They got rid of some of the older lease aircraft. You know, so if Lufthansa German Wings was a short-haul carrier, it's been closed. And you see that across the piece in Europe. Now, you know, will the short-haul stuff recover faster than the long-haul? It will. But I think Lufthansa, Air France, BA, and the bigger guys, they're actively trying to extend the slot waiver into the summer of 2021. So because they know the long haul will take time to recover, and a huge amount of their short haul traffic either feeds into or feeds from their long haul business. So they actively want to constrain capacity next summer, keep the planes on the ground, keep the fares high on whatever they fly, and rip off the consumer again, despite the fact that they've received over 30 billion in state aid. In Ryanair, we see a different future. We see a strong recovery. We need more aircraft, but we can only deliver that strong recovery if we lower prices. And it's going to be one of the critical issues next summer is, can we lower prices? And that means lower ATC charges, lower airport charges, and governments to scrap some of these anti-consumer taxes to get tourism and travel back in Europe again.
A lot to talk about there. And, you know, I'd love to talk about lower ATC charges. But before I get to that, let's go back to the slots point just for a moment. If the big carriers are hoarding their slots, are you saying you'd like to get into Heathrow and into Frankfurt and into Charles de Gaulle?
Well, I'm already in Frankfurt. I would never want to get into Heathrow, and I would never want to get into Charles de Gaulle either. But I mean, you take, you know, the great slot holders are KLM at Schiphol. Schiphol is artificially constrained. You know, there's absolutely no reason for the slot limit in Schiphol. They're delaying, the Dutch government are working with KLM and with Schiphol to delay the opening of Lelystad, which is the lower cost airport. All of it is designed to limit KLM from competition while giving them 3.5 or 4 billion of state aid anyway. That repeats at other airports. We could, and other low-fare airlines could, go into some of those more major airports where we already operate. I mean, I'd like to expand more in Berlin, in Rome, in Amsterdam, but we will be prevented from doing so through the summer of 2021 if the European Commission wrongly extends the slot waiver to protect these high-fare, hugely subsidised legacy airlines.
So you'd fly into Amsterdam, by way of example, in 21, but the slot waiver would stop you from building that up into 22. That's the issue.
Well, no, if you were flying in there in summer 21, you'd have the slots. You'd have the slots for summer 22 as well. But what KLM, Air France, Lufthansa are determined to do for the summer 21 is, we need the slot waiver to continue. And if they can block competition in summer 21 at some of those airports. Now, I already fly to Amsterdam, but in a very small way. But if they can block any competitive entrant into those airports in the summer 21, by the time you get through the winter 21 and summer 22, I think certainly short haul and long haul will probably have recovered post-COVID. And KLM could continue to have their Dutch monopoly in Schiphol and limit competition and keep screwing consumers and visitors to Holland for very high fares.
So talking about that for a moment, in the past, you've been quoted as saying you think there'll be 5 major airlines or airline groups in Europe mirroring what's going on in the United States, where 4 carriers have got about 90% of the market. Here it's a dozen carriers have got about 50%. The 5 groups, I guess, are Ryanair, IAG, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM. Who's the 5th, do you think?
And I would have said, well, I mean, at this point, I'm not sure how about IAG, because I'm not sure the post-Brexit scenario, BA can remain a member of IAG. But we take that as a group. I think that's clearly one of the big 4. I think there will be a 5th. I think the jury is out at the moment as whether EasyJet survives longer term as an independent airline, given its very high cost base, or whether Wizz overtakes it, or maybe Wizz merges with EasyJet and forms a 5th kind of competitor. I'm not quite sure. And it doesn't pay to be definitive about your predictions on the future of airlines in Europe. And I've been predicting Norwegian's bankruptcy for about the last 2 years. Eventually, I've been proven right, but it came about 2 years after I first predicted Norwegian would go bankrupt. But bankrupt they have gone. I suspect it may well be, it could well be some kind of amalgamation between Wizz and EasyJet, maybe Wizz and EasyJet, and then they merge with a Lufthansa or an Air France as well. Because I think, like the States, there will be 3 or 4 large legacy connecting carriers and 1 large low-fare airline. Wizz and EasyJet are not and will not be able to compete with Ryanair's cost base or with our fares. They accept that at the moment anyway. Is why they try to avoid competing with us, why they're all desperate to get slots at constricted airports where we don't operate. So ultimately, I think we would be the large EU low-fare airline, and that's good for EU consumers.
Well,
there will be a choice to the high-fare rip-off, state-aided, subsidised legacy highwaymen of Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, and IAG.
Before we get to that, and trust me, we're going to get to state aid. Before we get to that, the CEO of Wizz, Joseph Ferrati, speaking on a hard talk a while ago, said that he thought the A321 was going to be the breakthrough aeroplane, that it had a massive cost advantage. And obviously his staff is based largely in Hungary, which is a very low-cost destination or a low-cost location. You don't see Wizz as a cost competitor?
No. But Joe's been spinning that whole line for about the last 5 years. Eventually by 2025 or maybe 2050, he'll have a lower unit cost on some RASM, indeterminate basis as Ryanair. Look, he's been adding A321s for the last 2 and 3 years, and his cost per aircraft, his unit aircraft costs have been rising faster than Ryanair as we add our old cheap NG aircraft. The new game changer aircraft will be considerably cheaper than his A321s. He's still leasing all of his A321s. I suspect that one of his shareholders is taking some money off the table on all these sale and leasebacks, which they're perfectly entitled to do. But he has much higher airport costs than us. He has much higher aircraft costs than us. He does have a labour cost advantage with Eastern European employment practices. But as we've seen, as he moves into Norway, for example, in recent weeks, not alone has he run into opposition from the Norwegian unions, the Norwegian Prime Minister. He tried transferring or bringing in some Polish workers up there to open up the Trondheim base, and half of them failed the COVID test. So I think he's beginning to understand that operating in Western Europe, as Ryanair did in 2017 when we had to recognise unions, is considerably different. You will not get away in Western Europe, whether it's in Norway or Italy, with Wizz's model, which is based on a tax avoidance scam of employing people through a Hungarian employer, but paying them in Switzerland. It's simply not going to survive any expansion in Western Europe, which is why I think he will delay any expansion in Western Europe. He can't afford it. And he'll continue to expand in Dubai and outer Siberia and eastern China, about trying to get as far away from Ryanair as he possibly can, because every time he tries to compete with Ryanair, he loses.
I'm sure that there would be a lot of union people and others that are sort of smiling wryly at your comment that Wizz can't survive by employing through an individual employment agency. But it's certainly true that in the last few years, as you've expanded into Malta, into Austria, into Poland, you've become much, much more European, haven't you, rather than Irish? Is that how you see yourself now?
I mean, we always saw ourselves as European, Andrew. I mean, we were huge. We were the biggest airline in Spain for a number of years, biggest airline in Italy, we were the biggest airline in Poland. I mean, we're the biggest, either the number 1, number 2 airline in most European countries in which we operate. We've always seen ourselves as a European airline. Ireland's population of 5 million people, we outgrew Ireland many, many years ago. But we were non-union up until 2017. I think it was inevitable that we would be unionised at some point in time. I thought it was always going to be when we moved into and started opening up bases in France or in Scandinavia. It came a little earlier than I had originally predicted it. But I think if you look at the way we now have good relationships with most of the unions around Europe, we negotiate professionally and sensibly with them. We were the first airline during the COVID crisis to be out there negotiating pay cuts with our pilots and our cabin crew as a better alternative to job losses. We've agreed pay cuts for the first 2 years and then restoration of that pay over the following 3 years, which I think over a 5-year cycle is probably manageable. You know, we're willing to share the pain. And I think thus far the unions have found us professional and relatively straightforward to deal with. And we found them professional and relatively straightforward to deal with. There have been some messers, the Belgian cabin crew union, the Portuguese cabin crew union are messers. And those cases where we haven't been able to reach agreement, we've gone ahead with the job cuts. But in 90% of our markets, the unions have worked closely with us to agree pay cuts in the short term so that we can avoid job losses and job cuts.
So how have you found that when you're talking to governments and what have you, given you've taken that position, when at the same time billions and billions of euros has been poured into the legacy carriers in the way of state aid? Do you think the market will ever be fair or balanced, or is it now distorted forever?
Look, the market is distorted, but the market has always been distorted. I mean, it's one of the great failures of European air transport that every time there's a crisis, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, Iberia and Alitalia are straight out with the begging bowl, give us more state aid. You know, they never go to their shareholders. They never try and cut costs. But ultimately, I mean, I think that's in the medium to long term, not good for their futures. I mean, one of the problems that comes with receiving this huge and distorting state aid is they don't reduce pay. They don't improve labour efficiencies. The union refuses to, come up with the kind of efficiencies that are necessary in a modern airline. And so, yes, it will distort competition for the next 3 or 4 years, but over the medium and longer term, it will widen the gap in terms of productivity and cost between Ryanair and those legacy state-aided airlines.
And so what you were saying before, that you think the aim of the legacies is to keep the airfares up, which actually creates a market for you with lower costs. You see that as working quite well.
I do see this working quite well, except at those airports where they're able to use slot waivers through summer 2021 to artificially constrain not just capacity, but artificially constrain competition and choice.
Right.
So I think some of the airports are beginning to wake up to that. I think ACI have now become much more disgruntled and concerned about this kind of automatic slot waiver into summer 2021. There is a lot of traffic. And I think summer 21, there's going to be, as long as the vaccine rolls out by Easter this year, there's going to be a very strong snapback in short-haul travel across Europe. But some of the major airports are going to lose out on that because their legacy airlines are going to sit there with the planes on the ground, fat, dumb and happy, trying to screw people for €500 airfares to get to Palma and Malaga. And they'll be limited because of the slot waiver from working with airlines like Ryanair and other lower cost airlines who do have the capacity to apply or to deploy capacity flexibly into summer 21 and speed up the recovery.
So are you out there now talking to airports around Europe, trying to find the best sort of rates?
We are. In fact, we've made a lot of progress in recent weeks with airports in the UK, in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, even in Ireland, God help us, where we're talking to the airport about a short-term discounts, recovery discounts into summer 2021. We're pushing very hard in the UK, with the government, where they say, what can we do for the industry? I mean, what you could do for the industry is scrap APD for the next 1, 2, 3 years. I mean, I think one of the big problems we've had with all this state aid, which has always, has fundamentally damaged in the medium term, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM and others, is that if the state was going to intervene, what it should have done was to reduce the German aviation taxes, the French environmental taxes and UK APD. That way, at least the government intervention would have applied on a non-discriminatory basis, but it would have been passed on immediately to the consumer. Reduce taxes, it gets passed straight through the consumer. Write a check for 10 billion to Lufthansa, it just gets trousered by Carsten and all the other. The consumer sees none of it, or KLM and Air France, they just trouser the money and then, wait 6 months and go back to look for another 5 billion in even more state aid. so they can mop up an even bigger monopoly in Germany or France. So it doesn't work. Government intervention should have been and must still be about reducing the burden of costs on the consumer. And that is reduce aviation taxes for the next year or two, 21, 22. Support the ANSP recovery because, the ANSPs are going to come back looking for the airlines to pay to recover their losses. They should be picked up by government, again, because it's non-discriminatory and it applies equally to all passengers. Those are the kind of government supports we need. Not the usual European shoot itself in the foot, write a big check to the French, the Germans and the Spanish, not to mention the Italians.
Well, indeed. But just to come back to airport charges for a minute, do you think the airport sector is getting more competitive, is understanding the issue is about costs and charges and things like that?
Very slowly. I mean, there are still some airports who are just egregiously wedded to the subsidy tits. First to mind here becomes London Heathrow, who in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic were into the CAA looking for an increase in airport fees to recover their COVID losses. Owned by the richest shareholders, sovereign wealth funds, and yet straight away, the regulatory regime allows us to recover our losses from the poor old unsuspecting airline customer and the punter. So give us another increase in prices. Like the regulatory regime of European airports is a shambles. It rewards gold plating, it rewards inefficiency. Around the edges, there are some more productive or more competitive airports, and we're working with those airports. Like Stansted is a good example. The Italian airports have become much more commercial and much more willing to kind of compete with each other, because that's what we got to do. In this industry, we have two choices. We can recover quickly from the COVID-19 crisis, and we can recover slowly. And the way to recover quickly is to relieve the burden of taxation and monopoly airport fees from the consumer by lowering charges until we get volumes back up to their 2019 levels. But what the Heathrows and the regulated monopolies, the DA in Dublin, the Heathrows in London, they'll be straight back into the regulator. Oh, we lost all this money last year. The regulatory allowance allows us to recover all this money from who? The poor old airlines and customers who've had an even worse 2020. So allow us to increase fees into 2021 so that we can recoup the losses that we suffered last year. And the likes of John Holland, Kay and Heathrow, they never get it. They're a one-trick bloody pony who think that they're owed a living and they're owed, they paid out billions in dividends to their shareholders in recent years. And yet they won't go and ask those shareholders to put their hands in the pocket and bail them out.
Michael, you mentioned earlier Brexit and the impact of Brexit on IAG. You were very vocal in your support of the UK remaining in the European Union.
Yeah.
How do you see Brexit unfolding from here?
Well, I think firstly we've been entirely vindicated. I think Brexit has been a shambles. The Johnson government has been completely exposed. With their promises of an easy trade deal in the sunny uplands, it is one of the great economic disasters for the UK, shooting themselves in the foot. But nevertheless, we are where we are. I mean, look, I don't think it'll affect air travel that much. People will still move between Europe and the UK, between the UK and Europe. I do think, however, the French and Germans are going to be very strong on trying to upset the BA ownership within IAG. I cannot see how IAG can survive as an owner of BA in a post-Brexit environment. But, therefore, I think it is likely that there will be some breakup of the IAG group, or BA will have to step outside the IAG group. Other than that, it will add, I think, some regulatory challenges for people travelling to and from the UK. I think the millions of UK consumers we have who visit Europe will be dismayed to find themselves in the non-EU passport control section, but it is what it is. It's a tragedy. If isolationism was the secret to economic success, North Korea would be the great economic engine of the Western world. It isn't. Isolationism is doomed to failure. We need the UK as part of a strong single market in Europe. And the single market is much stronger with the UK as a member, but we are where we are and we just have to get on with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, moving on. Sustainability is one of everybody's favourite words at the moment. There's been a lot of talk about the new Green Deal and so forth. you have got brand new aeroplanes, which will clearly reduce your emission per passenger. How do you see the next 5 years going in terms of flight shaming and all of those sorts of things?
I suspect the environmental agenda will weaken for the next number of years because, frankly, the fiscal challenges being faced by most European governments, the huge rates of unemployment. We need to encourage air travel to return. We've got to get tourism industries restarted. We've got to get young kids back to work in the tourism industry. But it's not going away. Learning to grow and fly in an environmentally sensitive or better way is clearly a challenge for all of us. That's why we think the new Boeing game changer order is a game changer for us. We will be able to fly 4% more passengers on every flight, but burn 16% less fuel. So there's a huge environmental saving, there's a huge fuel cost saving as well in this new order. And I think all of the airlines are committed to reducing our environmental footprint. I think the one challenge we call out to the European Union, which always likes to talk about the environment, is we're still nowhere on a single European sky. The amount of fuel and environmental damage that is caused by air traffic control delays and inordinate flight journeys as a result of inefficient ATC routings continues to grow. And I think that's a challenge for the ANSPs. You know, if Europe is really serious about reducing the aviation footprint of the environmental footprint of aviation, get rid of the single European sky. I would actually perfectly prefer to see the individual national ANSPs compete with each other so that we get to much more efficiency. But I think Eamonn Brennan and the team at EUROCONTROL have done a remarkable job in the last 12 months, particularly in 2019, of improving the efficiency, certainly of the flow management across Europe. And the more they can deliver to that agenda, the more we as an industry can reduce our environmental footprint, because that's ultimately what our customers demand and what we will have to deliver.
But so when you say individual ANSPs competing, you would like to reach your own agreement with an ANSP to do all of your controlling?
I think more of, I mean, look, you know, if you go back to the airline model, competition between the airlines has dramatically transformed air travel across Europe. It's been the great success of the single market in the last 20 years. You know, we no longer have legacy airline monopolies. Yet we still have legacy ANSP monopolies. And it's a joke that we have to kind of zigzag between national ANSPs to get from Dublin to Greece. We should be able to fly straight. We should be able to negotiate with the Belgians or with the French or with the Irish to provide us with that service without having to pay off every other ANSP. And competition between the ANSPs would, in my view, improve productivity and lower costs. It would reward whoever is the most effective, most efficient producer. And it would also eliminate the scandal of ATC strikes, which is generally visited on us by the French and the Spanish, usually during the summer, where we all have to fly around France. I mean, it's a joke. The technology exists to fly straight over. And if the French want to go on strike, cancel the French flights. What happens during French ATC strikes is the French government protects the French domestic flights, and all the non-French flights take all the delays and cancellations. So the CSAR has been a failure. I've given up on it. I think it's 20 years old. We've wasted billions on it. We should free up the individual ANSPs to compete against each other and to provide EUROCONTROL as the flow manager with more efficient services at lower prices.
So have you
that then we could pass on to our customers in the form of lower airfares.
So have you put these sorts of concerns or these sorts of ideas to the Commission? Why are we Why are we stuck trying to still get a single European sky 25 years later?
Because it's a whole industry in Brussels that's full, committed to delivering the undeliverable, a single European sky. The unions like sitting around talking about it. They do nothing, they deliver nothing. It's been one, again, the great failures of the European Union. A single European sky has gone nowhere in 20 years. It's just a talking shop. If you were to deregulate it and open it up to competition between the ANSPs, and let the best ANSP win. But at the moment, we're heading for some kind of gargoyle that will have, Spanish payment levels and French productivity, and, nobody will be flying anywhere across Europe. We need to break it up. Competition and deregulation has transformed the flight experience for consumers across Europe, and we need competition and deregulation among the ANSPs as well to allow EUROCONTROL to deliver a much more efficient, much more cost-effective service, not just to Europe's consumers, but to our tourism industry as well.
Okay, so all of that would be terrific, obviously. What is the one thing you think that will bring aviation back in the next 2 years? What one single thing is the most important?
I mean, the single thing that's most important is a vaccine. I think the vaccine will be rolled out. I think there'll be multiple vaccines in the first quarter of next year. I think a lot of governments are going to be embarrassed into rolling out the vaccine quicker than they presently plan to. The British have already approved it. So instead of it locking down every other European country, politicians are going to have to explain how many vaccines have you got and when are you rolling them out. So the vaccine is the most important. But thereafter that, absolutely next is going to be having lower cost stimulus for summer 21, winter 21, summer 22. That is, scrap temporarily, if needs be, aviation taxes, scrap the environmental taxes, airports to lower their charges through the summer of 21, so that together we can all pass on lower prices to consumers. Pricing will get the volumes back. I mean, I don't have any faith in these kind of lazy analysis. Oh, it'll take till 2025 or 2026 to go back to pre-COVID 2019 levels. Actually, I think we'll get back there by about 2022, but only if we have lower pricing. And then pricing may take a couple of years after that to recover. And that's certainly why we're committed. Like, we've ordered our new deal with Boeing. We take 30 new aircraft in advance of summer 21, 80 new aircraft in advance of summer 22. Wow. So if there's any airports out there on this call and you're worried about Lufthansa not returning your traffic, which they won't, by the way, or KLM, or call Ryanair, the new routes team. We have up to 80 new aircraft we can offer you over the next 18 months, and we'll return your traffic when your state-aided, heavily subsidised legacy carrier certainly won't. They're out there trying to screw you over on a slot waiver through summer 21 and into winter 21 if they could too.
So how, with the lower fares, which you think will bring back the traffic, how will that wash through all of the remaining carriers? Do you think it will put a lot of those carriers under enormous financial stress?
No, I mean, look, all the other carriers now are just going to keep getting state aid. I mean, Alitalia is going to keep going back to Italian, going to get more. Lufthansa is already mumbling about they need another $5 billion for next year. KLM is, they're not going to be under financial stress because they know governments are going to bail them out. I think ourselves, the non-state aided carriers, will be under financial pressure. I wouldn't say distress. But our response is going to be get back flying quickly, get passengers on board quickly. It may be at cheaper fares, but get the business moving again. And the hoteliers, the tourism industry, unemployment, record unemployment around Europe. We need the European Union to stimulate tourism if you're going to get young people back to work. And that's the fastest way to recover from the COVID pandemic.
So what is it, Michael, that wakes you up at 3 a.m? What is it that you're most worried about?
I think the fact that I wasn't invited to the Hungarian MEP's orgy in Brussels, if I've been asked, what can Eamonn Brennan do for me? Get me an invitation to the next orgy in Brussels. I've never been to one, and I'd very much like to join in.
Right. Well, you've actually preempted my final question, which is, apart from an invitation to an orgy, what more do you think Eurocontrol and Eamonn and Eurocontrol can do to help build back better aviation next year and into the future?
I think they can help us lobby the European Commission. I think they need European governments to fund the ANSP deficits. You can't turn around and ask the airlines or our customers in a post-COVID recovery to pay for the deficits of ANSPs. Governments need to pick that up. It's not a subsidy to us, it's a subsidy to the consumer. It's a small amount of money, but that's what's necessary. And then I think we need, over the medium term, Eurocontrol needs to take more of a leadership role as the flow manager, the deliverer of more efficient, more direct flight routings across Europe, lowering charges for ANSP providers by encouraging those ANSP providers to compete against each other in the same way that the airlines do. But be in no doubt, there is going to be a very strong recovery post-COVID, not necessarily in summer 21, but through the winter 21, summer 22 into 2023. I see Ryanair recovering very strongly. I mean, we carried 150 million passengers last year prior to COVID. That will fall to probably around 35 million passengers this year. Next year into summer 21, it could be anything between 95 to 125 million passengers. But after that, I think we're back on track heading towards 200 million passengers with a fleet of really exciting new Boeing game-changer aircraft and we want to put those at airports all over Europe so we can work with our airport partners to see Europe fire back strongly, quickly, and get lots of those unemployed pilots and cabin crew back into jobs, well-paid jobs working for Ryanair.
I can't think of a more optimistic note to end on. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure even with the technical problem, for which I can only apologise again, I'm sure you agree that that was a really fascinating conversation. That brings Hard Talk Live to an end for this year, but as Eamonn mentioned, we'll be back next year with still more really interesting presentations and really interesting conversations. So only to thank you again, Michael, for your time and for your great explanations, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you, folks, and remember, for Christmas, fly Ryanair. If you can't fly Ryanair, buy our gift voucher. Somebody else can fly with us in next year. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Eamonn.